the AIPG Texas section is arranging a 2.5-day field trip to West Texas Panhandle on the weekend of April 22nd to 24th next year. And we'll be visiting some of the structural geology and volcanic things, but the trip will be focused on a rare earth mine that's being ready for production at Round Top or Round Mountain, and some talc mines, and maybe we'll swing by the blue, whatever it is, space station that's out there in West Texas. I think it's Elon Musk's, I'm not sure. So anyway, that should be a really good trip. You'll see a lot of geology. There'll also be a focus on hydrogeology and the bolsons out there. Good. Okay, so welcome everybody, especially the people from out of state. And this is the third of 3 talks on the geology of Central Texas. And I'm going to be talking about the Tertiary epoch from 65 million years to 1.8 million years, leaving the possibility of a 4th talk, maybe, on the Quaternary. So in this talk, we'll be focusing quite a bit on natural resources, especially in the Eocene. And of course, I'll show a few pictures of the mammals that were taking over from the dinosaurs, and say a little bit about oil resources in the Gulf Coast. So this is a beautiful outcrop in the Bastrop area, and it's very accessible. If you want to quickly note the address. And what you're looking at is the Carrizo sandstone on the bottom, and that's at the top of the WILCOX group of Eocene age. And then at about 50 feet above the present level of the Colorado River, there's nonconformity with a package of Colorado River gravels above it. And at 62 feet, another 12 feet higher, there's a second unconformity with another package. The first one is 1.2 million years old, and the second one is just under 1 million years old. So there's about 52 million years missing at the basal unconformity there on the Carrizo. So the Colorado during this 1 million year time period was aggrading, which suggests either that the sea level was rising, the base level was rising so that it couldn't carry all its sediment, or that the sediment supply from upstream was increasing. And that's some of what we'll talk about later. So in outline, what I'm going to be talking about is there'll be a couple of slides transitioning from the last talk. Then I'll cover the PETM, the Paleocene Eocene thermal maximum, and the WILCOX group and its resources that were deposited during the Eocene climatic optimum. Then I'll discuss the rather controversial Yoakum Canyon, which is also in the WILCOX group, and I'll pretty well skip the Oligocene, which doesn't have any outcrop in the Austin area, and talk about the Rio Grande rifting and the Balcones faulting, and end up with the Ogallala, which is our major aquifer out in West Texas. So on the right-hand side here is the Western Interior Seaway, and I'm showing the positions in a continuous blue line of the Laramide and Hidalgo, Sierra Madre Oriental fronts, tectonic fronts, and in a dashed line, the buried position of the Ouachita front that we've talked about before, and Austin is that red star as usual. By the beginning of the Tertiary, the Western Interior Seaway was essentially filled up with the sedimentary detritus from these orogenic events labeled as Laramidia off here. The Laramide sensu strictu, 75 to 45 million years, was basement chord uplifts and basins of very diverse trends, north, south to east, west, and all sorts of things. And I personally get very upset when people all over the world use the term Laramide for an orogeny of this age, because the Laramide is very unusual, and that style is restricted to what you see just here in the western United States and northern Mexico. The other 7 or 8 orogenic belts in purple are conventional fold thrust belts related to subduction with a oblique subduction with a right lateral offset along the western coast of the North American continent. And Texas sits in the gap between the Sevier orogeny, which lasted from 150 million years to 50 million years, and the Hidalgan, which was a much shorter event, overlapping pretty much with the Laramide further north, but a completely different style. Note Cuba, which this will come into play later. Cuba started out down along the, I forget the exact name now, the Managua, I think, transformed here between Honduras and Guatemala, but it moved northward as an island arc terrain until it ended up abutting the continental shelf of Florida, and that we'll talk about later. The analogies for modern analogies for the Western Interior Seaway and it's being filled up are the Ganges Valley and the Po Valleys. It's an exact analogy for those valleys. So this is one of Pete Rose's maps from his 2016 paper at the GCAGS. And Pete has done a lot of really beautiful work on the evolution of the Llano Uplift area and the Edwards Plateau. So what we're looking at is the structure contour map, and at the end of Edwards deposition, the Edwards was at sea level and flat. But here on the southeast edge of the map, the top of the Edwards is at minus 15,000 feet along what was in the Cretaceous to Stewart City Reef trend. And up in the northwest corner, near the New Mexico border, it's well over 3,000 feet high. And what Peter's plotted here in a dashed line is the Frio River hinge line, and I'll show that with my cursor. The Frio River hinge line is here, and that's basically the line between things that go up and things that go down. He's also shown the Ouachita front, the Ouachita structural front where the thrusting ends, and the Ouachita metamorphic front where everything east of that is metamorphosed. Notice that the highest Edwards on this map is not where the Paleozoic rocks in the Llano Uplift are exposed. It's well southwest of that. The oblique lines here, shading here, is the exposed Llano, the exposed Paleozoic and Precambrian rocks of the Llano Uplift. So there are really two highs on it, one older and one more recent, and a low in between them. And the whole thing is being tilted, and as you go from northeast to southwest, the tilting gets more and more strong. It gets magnified. So now to the stratigraphy of the area, and if you're from Georgia, many of these terms will still be familiar to you. We have the Midway and the lower Paleocene, and then the WILCOX, which covers the upper Paleocene and the lower Eocene, and there's a deltaic, fluvial deltaic sequence. And above that, the Queen City, Sparta, Yegua, Jackson, Trio, and all of these things. And these are all, again, largely fluvial deltaic sequences. And you can see that the continental slope, which is way over to the left here at the beginning, goes further to the left during the Eocene climatic optimum, because sea level rose, and then sea level starts to fall on average, and these deltas build out more and more and more beyond the Eocene continental shelf, forming a huge plastic wedge. Over on the right here, I've turned the graph of sea level sideways, so it's hard to read. It's some of it's upside down, but what I'm trying to show by doing that is that the sea level very much parallels the progress of this continental margin. Also, there's this green spike on the sea level that lasted only 140,000 years. That's the Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum. When things really got out of hand, temperatures went up by about, globally went up by about 8 degrees Celsius. There was jungles at the poles and so on. But things went back to normal pretty quickly. But then when they went back to normal, they also went back to the normal increasing sea level and increasing CO2 in the atmosphere, and also very high oxygen levels. So by the Middle Eocene, we had the highest sea levels we've seen in the Phanerozoic. And again, we had warm climates with lush vegetation and with creatures that you don't see outside of temperate regions in both poles. And one of the contributing factors to this broad, well, the major contributing factor to this broad warming and rising sea level was the Atlantic large igneous province. This hundreds, maybe thousands of cubic miles of basalt were erupted in what is now the North Atlantic by around the Icelandic hotspot. There's a mantle plume, and this basalt had lots and lots of CO2 dissolved in it, which got released to the atmosphere, warming things up very considerably. So if we follow this sea level thing, we get to the top of the Eocene and Oligocene boundary. All of a sudden, or all of a sudden on this chart, probably not so sudden in reality, Antarctica became glaciated. And that caused the Earth's albedo to rise, its reflectivity to rise. And so we had a forward feedback mechanism that decreased the temperature even further and relatively rapidly. So largely, the temperature was dropping to the point where we got glaciation, but then the glaciation caused a rapid drop. Things then went on sort of kind of smoothly and got a little bit warmer. The Antarctic melted at the end of the Oligocene. Then temperatures began to go down a bit. There was a little bit of an increase in the mid-Miocene, and then down, so that somewhere in the mid to late Miocene, the Antarctic got reglaciated and temperatures really started to go down. And in addition to that, the magnitude of these short-term temperature swings increased and increased and increased until we got the Pleistocene ice ages. And all of this is reflected in the dropping sea levels and in the building out of these deltaic tertiary sediments into the Gulf of Mexico. And I'm going to focus on the Eocene because I know it better and because it's the rest of these sequences have got great similarities to the Eocene. Back to the temperature thing. This is just a bit more detail. There's the PETM, 140,000 years of it, and then the Antarctic, and you can see it in more detail here. Part of the Eocene optimum was also due to the opening of the Atlantic, which allowed warm water to circulate up to the poles. So what was life like? Well, of course, the great bolide at the end of the Cretaceous got rid of the dominant dinosaurs and large reptiles, but pretty soon the little mammals that were left grew bigger. They had no more competition. So you have Coryphodon here, 7 feet long and 1,000 pounds already in the Eocene. But notice that it's a fairly generalized mammal. It doesn't have great horns or tusks or odd things or a huge long neck or anything. The same with the small Tylodus or essentially an Ua rat. It's not fully evolved the long prehensile tail of the rats that we have today. And then we have two sort of primitive hyenas here that are chewing on a crocodile in the middle of a redwood forest. So that's redwood forests were common and inhabited by some large and rather fierce mammals. So the WILCOX group was about a 6 million year interval from mid-upper Paleocene to mid-upper Eocene, and consists largely of these deltaic sediments that range from, well, depending where you are, some of them are fluvial rather than deltaic. So you have sandstones filling river channels, you have overpaint deposits due to the river's flooding, you have shallow water deposits, you have strand lines, you have, all of these different things. And here in this piece of core on the right, you can see these intertidal muds and siltstones, and they're not bioturbated, which to me means that, and they're also gray, which to me means that there was such a lack of oxygen when they were being laid down that there was nothing burrowing into them. But there was some input of coarser detritus here. So it's hard to decide whether the general fine-grained is because there was nothing coarse-grained or very little coarse-grained to be transported, or whether it was truly a low-energy environment. But odd events happen from time to time. Here we have some low-grade bituminous coal from northeast Texas. There are huge coal resources in the WILCOX that have been mined all the way from near Austin at the Alcoa plant. Anyway, it's about 25 miles from Austin, and there was a huge mine there. It's all being reclaimed, and there were lignite mines all the way up around the Gulf Coast to the Louisiana border, and most of it was very low grade. But on the uplift in northeast Texas near the Louisiana border, they reached they were buried much more deeply, and they reached low grade with coal rain. So here's what one of these mines looked like, and a pile of, I guess, discarded or reject material that was too much rock in it or something, and it piled up and it spontaneously ignited, and this goes on all the time. This was a horrible, wet, rainy day, and you can see how barren and nasty the landscape looks, and that's typical of most mines on a wet, rainy day. So miles to the south in Elgin, which is 25 miles east of Austin, we have a very well-known, famous brick industry, Elgin Bricks, about 3 companies making them, and they mine the same rock units, the WILCOX. And here we have a very low-grade lignite or lignitic shale that underlies a nice pure clay laminated reduced shale. You can see it's reduced where it's not covered with debris, it's gray. And you can see the fine bedding or lamination up where my cursor is in the top left corner there. Just below the contact of the clay with the lignite, there's a burn layer where the lignite caught fire in some wildfire. There's a little bit of unburned lignite above that. So this is typical of what you see in the brick quarries around Elgin. Along the Colorado River Trail in the town of Bastrop, there's a wonderful park and makes a great field trip. You see this sort of thing. This is channel sand, and here's some trough cross beds here, and then they're overlain unconformably by much more flat-lying cross beds. And again, they're very finely bedded. I wouldn't call that laminated, but they are very finely bedded. And I tried to reconstruct some of the paleogeography of the Bastrop area from water wells, which is a very fraught undertaking because drillers' logs are not very reliable. But I find that each individual driller is rather consistent in their rock descriptions. And what I found was you could, for instance, in the Bastrop City water well field, they have a lot of wells, and some of them are only a couple of 100 feet apart. And in one, you'll have 100 feet of sandstone, and in the other one, you'll have none, next to 200 feet away. So you've got very steep wall channels filled with these sandstones. And these channels were cutting through belong to a major river, cutting through a floodplain just before it entered into the continental shelf. So, and the sandstones themselves, of course, back to this one, they have excellent permeability and porosity. And since the Eocene in the down dip in the Gulf is highly structured by the presence of salt beneath it, and it goes along the flanks of salt domes and things, there's loads and loads and loads of great oil fields in these fluvial channel sands of the Eocene, as well as in the beach sands of the WILCOX. And here you can see, this is another of Pete Rose's diagrams from his 2006 paper, 16 paper, I'm sorry. And this is the Llano Uplift area again here. Austin is there. And you can see the San Marcos Arch, which was the major Mesozoic feature in this area, and the Austin, the Eagleford and the Austin chalk barely got across it. They thinned radically on it. You can see it's still influencing deposition in the early Eocene. This is the inner edge of the early Eocene coastal plain. But as you go into the middle Eocene and the upper Eocene, it has less and less influence. But the hinge line is somewhere right around Austin, and you can see how the dip is steepening to the southeast, and we get down to 5,000 feet at this average maximum prograded shoreline here. So these are contours on the Eocene rocks here. Now we come to the Yoakum Canyon. This is exciting, and I'm trying to sit on the fence about it. But the Yoakum Canyon starts near Bastrop. It can be mapped in shallow ancient oil wells in Bastrop County, and that's why I was looking at the water wells. I wanted to trace it further up dip, and then it heads on this course we see here down into across a couple of counties to the south end of Lavaca County. It's more than 10 miles wide. Look at this scale down here. It's approaching 15 miles wide at the bottom end. and it's nearly 3,000 feet deep. It's a little bit smaller and a little more shallow than the Grand Canyon. It cuts through all of the Middle Eocene rocks, all these nice interlayered sandstones and overbank deposits and beaches and all this sort of thing. All of these things which have lots of lovely oil fields in them are just cut by this huge canyon, which is filled with upper WILCOX clays. Just a great big plug of impermeable clay that filled it as sea level rose and sediment washed down from the rivers. And if you look at the map here, there's the red star for Austin. This thing here, which I hope you can see a little dashed, it's got dots in it, is the Yoakum Canyon, 100 miles long, and as I say, 3,000 feet deep. And it's heading straight for Austin. And why is that? Well, because Austin's on the Colorado River. This is from a wonderful book. This illustration here is from a wonderful book by Tom Ewing, and it's published by the Bureau of Economic Geology. And Tom shows the Colorado as veering a bit to the south here, but really the canyon is on the must have been cut by an ancestor of the Colorado River. You notice the Brazos River here, and the Red River doesn't exist here. They have the Rockdale River, which gave rise to the Rockdale Delta in WILCOX time, and an ancestor of the Rio Grande, which gave rise to the Rosita Delta. Now, one of the things that brought people's attention to this canyon is that 20 years ago or so ago, they started finding huge amounts of WILCOX aged sediment in the deep water gulf overlying forming the sediments in the abyssal plain out in front of all the salt tectonics. So the question then became, well, how did this WILCOX get out there and where did it come from? And there are people who say, there are two opinions. One is that it was a submarine canyon because the shelf was so piled up with sediment that it became unstable and there was earthquakes or something happened, floods, and it slumped and formed turbidity currents which eroded the canyon out into the deep water Gulf of Mexico. And there's another group that says, well, no, Cuba was moving north. Remember, I pointed to Cuba at the beginning here. Cuba was moving north, hit the continental shelf off of Florida, dammed up the entrance to the Gulf of Mexico from the Atlantic Ocean, and the Gulf of Mexico dried up. And so the Colorado River's ancestor cut this canyon, and it was above sea level when it did it. So there are some arguments against that. One is that there is no no extensive evaporite layer of that age in the deep water Gulf, which there should be. And by the way, the Yoakum Canyon is not unique. There's at least one more large canyon in the same southeast Texas, and there are several in Mexico. So there were a group of these canyons all cut around the same age. So here's the hypothesis about drying up the Gulf of Mexico. And this is a paper by Josh Rosenfeld, 2020, in the AIPG Explorer. And he shows, this is a echo sounder, depth sounder map of the Florida Strait between Cuba and Florida. And he shows this channel that comes in. It's very shallow, or relatively shallow, up to the northeast here. But all of a sudden, there's this big cliff, big semicircular cliff here. And then you get a channel that becomes, it's bedrock at first, and then becomes filled with sediment. And Josh says that these cliffs, which are 1,000 feet high nearly, are cliffs carved by waterfalls in a subaerial environment. And so the analogy there would be Horseshoe Falls at Niagara. And if you look at the seismic section at the bottom here, there's the canyon. This the yellow line here is the seismic section, and this canyon, which is not the Yoakum Canyon. Remember, this is the feeder canyon to the evaporating Gulf of Mexico that's between Florida and Cuba on the other side of the Gulf. So that canyon is 800 meters deep. It cuts way down into the Cretaceous, almost the basement, and it is filled clearly with some of these eroded tertiary sediments here. So you got 600 or so meters of fill here. So that's the map. Cuba, this area behind the red line is not where Cuba was. It's the tectonic front due to the movement of Cuba, and the Florida Straits are here, and these canyons cut through this area here. So that cross section was roughly from 3 to 5 on this map. And here's the inland sea that they deposit, that evaporate. But as I say, you know, we don't have evaporite deposits that substantiate that, and there's just a lot of argument about whether it's a submarine canyon, that these are submarine canyons or subaerial canyons. But it's exciting to think that one of these days soon somebody will figure that out. So here's this is from the UT thesis by Dingus, and it shows, it's a 3D rendering of the canyon, and it's about a 40 to 1 vertical exaggeration. And again, you see it's roughly 15 miles wide here and 3,000 feet deep. Pretty impressive. So going back to the wildlife, Eocene animals, 55 to 34 million years, getting bigger. 2.5 tons is Eobasileus. There's a crocodile in here who's also pretty big, and Leo, a lion, down here, and big down there, and Eohippus here. And but these tertiary mammals are beginning to do the funny things that dinosaurs did and get exaggerated horns and funny things on their heads. There were also a few big reptiles like this 42 feet long gigantoboa that lived in the Eocene. By the Oligocene, we're having horrendous 100-pound hyena-type animals with very, very nasty jaws, and obviously built for very quick chases. And some of these things, like the Titanothere, which is an ungulate, in other words, related to deer and cows and things, is developed these very funny shovel-shaped horns here, and this huge hump on its back. So we're seeing the same sort of thing with mammals here as we did with reptiles in the Mesozoic. Things are getting more exotic with time. Other things to note about the Oligocene are that this is the age of the amber in the Baltic area, where we have beautifully preserved butterflies, bees, ants, and spiders and things, along with their parasites, and sometimes along with some, I believe, some recoverable DNA. I'm not sure about that. It's also, the Oligocene is also the time of Parapithecus, the earliest ape-like animal that was found in Egypt. Very small, incidentally. I forget the size, but maybe a couple of feet tall. And it's also, there were also old world monkeys. And then in the late Oligocene, we start seeing New World monkeys in South America. And I remember when I was taking Geology 1 in 1961, kind of laughing at the professor in my mind, because the text he and the textbook both were talking about this humongously long land bridge, 1,000 miles long or something, and just 100 miles wide, that you had to have to get the New World monkeys from Africa to South America. This was the days of dogmatic fixist continents. The main unit in the Oligocene in the Gulf of Mexico is the Frio, which is another humongous oil play. So by the Miocene, we're starting to see this tilting. And one of the first signs of that in central Texas is the Balcones Fault Zone. And this is an outcrop of the Mount BONNELL Fault in a school playground very close to where I live. And we're looking, this thing here strikes northeast. And what it is, what this thing is a series of slicken-sided, mineralized, closely spaced fault slip surfaces. And everything dips at about 70 degrees to the southeast. And the slicken lines on these surfaces plunge about 70 degrees to the northeast. But on each individual fault slip layer, polished layers they are, the slicken lines have slightly different plungings. So they don't, when these things move, they didn't move in quite the same direction every time. On this big boulder here that I have my hand on, you can see the near horizontal bedding. It's dipping gently to the northeast again. And below that, this is all fault breccia here. And it's really messed up rock. There's fault breccia there too, at the front of the block that I'm standing next to. And then there's this rusty stuff, which is again fault breccia, which must have been mineralized with some iron. And I assume this is an anticlinal structure. This gentle northeast dip flattens out and becomes southwest dip, a long strike. So I assume that focused some warm water coming up from depth along the fault. And the result of that was not only a lot of bugs developed in the breccia, but lots of beautiful blue crystals of celestite, strontium sulfate, and the curved crystals of dolomite. I've forgotten the name for them right now. I assume that some of these waters carried some iron and sulfur too, so you had a little pyrite or something. They weren't hot waters, I don't think. They in other places they form a network of dolomitic veins in the hanging wall of the fault. So here's the map, and the Burdigalian 21 million years ago. I don't know why Tom decided to use those sort of international terms here, but we see that we're getting this tilting, and we have in the Burdigalian between 28 million years and 13 million years at the end of the Miocene, we have 8,500 feet of erosion here. That's the amount, that is a good measure of the amount of tilting up along the flanks of the Rio Grande Rift. So here these pink things are bits of Rio Grande Rift. And at the other side of this, we have the Balcones Fault Zone, which has overall about 1,000 feet of throw down to the southeast. And then we have the Miocene sediments of the coastal plain. You can see here the Pecos River existed, but it didn't join the Rio Grande. It went off the Guadon River, which roughly corresponds to the Nueces today. And then there's the lower Rio Grande, and it ended up going a different way around Big Bend. So 6 million years later, we have these big highlands up in northeastern New Mexico, we have the well-developed rift here of the Rio Grande, and we have on the coastal plain the same sequences. We also have the Red River and the Pecos Nueces and the Concho lower Rio Grande. So this tilting is very radical, from 9,000 feet high to 10,000 feet low. There are no Miocene rocks between a town called LaGrange, which is about 80 miles from Austin, and the Balcones Faults, which suggests that since the Balcones Fault was down from the whole area from the Balcones Fault to LaGrange was all above sea level at the time. Otherwise, the Miocene would still be there. So here's a summary with numbers on it. We have the Sangre de Cristo uplift here with Raton Base and Sierra Grande Dome. The base, I think these are the base Cretaceous contours. It's at over 7,000 feet there and about 9,000 feet here. And it declines down to the Austin area. Gradually, the rate of the slope is decreasing towards the Edwards Plateau. So we end up in the Pliocene on this very strongly tilted surface, which at the upper end is being eroded into a series of gravels, and there's also volcanoes along there too. And that's giving rise to this big sheet of Ogallala gravels that extends from about there where my cursor is all the way up into Nebraska and I think into Wyoming. It's possible that this sheet was continuous with these high-level gravels marked in black here, which are associated with some of the river valleys, and the Goliad Formation, which is a very anomalous gravel unit in the coastal plain. But it's impossible to prove a connection there because of the huge gaps. And it's sort of unlikely that they were connected because the Colorado River Valley, as we've seen, already existed in WILCOX time. So it's presumably the tributaries of the Colorado River would have nibbled away at the edges of the Ogallala and fed the gravel into the Colorado River. And that's what eventually ends up when we get to the Pleistocene as part of those terrace deposits in Bastrop. So, you know, again, there's large arguments about just how these units go together in a regional sense. But it's kind of amazing to imagine that there could have been one continuous sheet of gravel from Santa Fe to the Gulf Coast. So back to the animals. Everybody, I think, has seen the evolution of the horse from Eocene Eohippus to late Miocene Pliohippus. And maybe many people have also seen versions of this. The human family tree through the Tertiary, though, and the late Tertiary, because we don't really see anything like a human until the late Miocene, it is changing all the time because there's so much focus on looking for fossils of the genus Homo and its Australopithecine cousins. But so I mean, next week you might have a few more names sitting on this. I have never heard of Homo rudolfiensis before I saw this chart. That's the famous Homo habilis there, and Ergaster here, and Sapiens, and then they show the main branch going off to Homo erectus and Homo neanderthalensis. I don't think most of us would agree with that. And I already know, you know, in this part of the chart, this part of the chart, Homo sapiens part of the chart, we already know that there's another lost variety of Homo sapiens that was found in Russia called called Denisovan man. I think they have one little finger of the critter, but its DNA is completely different from ours, and shows up in certain people from certain parts of Asia. So other things were like this Bohaskaya, a toothed whale, very similar to modern whales. And then the terror bird, Titanus walleri, this huge kiwi-looking thing with a giant beak, which evolved in South America and made it up into North America during the Pliocene. I don't think I'd have liked to have been around when that thing was hunting. And then this is a summary of the erosional history over the Llano Uplift again by Pete Rose. And here's the present surface of the Llano Uplift. And this is all the Cretaceous that was eroded off, plus the Midway basal tertiary here that was eroded off the Llano Uplift. But once you cross the Balcones Fault, almost everything that was eroded away is tertiary, the lower and upper WILCOX, the Claiborne, the Jaeger-Jackson. But Pete calculated that about 2,100 feet on average had been removed between the Balcones Fault and where the Edwards Plateau begins. And so I made did the same work with a slightly different method and arrived at 2,800 feet. And I think that's about as good agreement as you can get with something with as many unknowns and missing data as that. Pete's area that he calculated the 2,100 feet from was this. And my area was the Colorado River drainage basin, which is basically that. So the inferred erosion rate from this amount of erosion is 32 to 43 feet per million years, or 10 to 13 meters per million years. And that's rather low. Much harder rocks in the Appalachians have eroded at about 25 meters per million years. What that suggests is that this area never really got, or for very long periods, did not get much above sea level. The rivers were not able to cut down much and accelerate erosion. So we're back to that original slide with the Carrizo down here, 52 million years old, and the Colorado gravel deposits, 2 lots of them, with the river aggrading because it wasn't able to cut down much, so, which is why we don't have high erosion rates over long periods of time. And if you look at these gravels, which are at Bastrop, which is only 35 miles or so from the Balcones Faults, and everything from the Austin chalk outcrops were about 5 miles in front of that. So basically you're 30 miles at Bastrop from limestone. And a professor at UT who is a friend of mine, Earl McBride, for decades has had a competition going. He has offered $1 to anybody who can find a limestone pebble in this conglomerate. Nobody's ever won. So it means that even the hardest limestones in the Edwards and Glen Rose Formation cannot make it 35 miles down the Colorado River and survive. The other thing noticeable about this conglomerate is all the soil, the lack of well-defined bedding, the lack of cross-stratification, and the quite frequent imbrication. You notice there's a lot of pebbles sort of organized pointing down to the lower right corner of the picture. And these all indicate a braided river in an arid environment. And the aggradation suggests the same thing because braided rivers have steeper gradients. So you can think of Texas a million years ago as being pretty much a desert crossed by braided rivers rather than meandering rivers. And here we have the climate chart with these 41 kiloyear glacial cycles. These rocks are this age here, about 1 million years, 1.2 to 1 million years, at the transition to a glacial climate, right on the transition, which suggests to me that as climatic belts moved southward in the northern hemisphere, the Texas was getting more into a dry environment. So that suggests that, and that's about right. We're 30 degrees north, which is like the limit of the desert belt. And so as climate got colder, Texas was moving more into the desert belt. And so that's the end of my story for this month. And I'm open to questions and chat.